Intelligence is becoming the most powerful force in the modern world. Not just artificial intelligence, not just analytics, not just automation. Intelligence as a capability. The ability to turn data into decisions, decisions into advantage, and advantage into lasting power. It shapes economies. It influences elections and markets. It determines who gets a loan, who gets hired, which neighborhoods get investment, and which ones get ignored. It decides which voices get amplified, and which ones get buried. And here's the part we have to say out loud. Power without governance turns into instability. Intelligence without oversight turns into risk. And intelligence at scale, moving faster than human attention, becomes something else entirely, a new kind of force that can reshape society before society even realizes what happened. So tonight, we're stepping into a question that's uncomfortable, necessary, and long overdue. How do we govern intelligence, ethically, strategically, and globally, before it governs us? Because if we don't design the rules, the incentives will. If we don't set the boundaries, the market will. If we don't build oversight, we'll end up living inside systems we can't explain, can't audit, and can't control. This is the B.I. channel. And this is episode 41. Welcome back to the B.I. channel. I'm your host, Nakel Nakima, and today we're going straight into one of the defining challenges of the intelligence age. We've spent years talking about building smarter systems. We've celebrated breakthroughs. We've optimized everything that can be measured. But now the conversation has to mature. Because intelligence isn't just a tool anymore. It's infrastructure. It's influence. It's leverage. And when something becomes infrastructure, you don't just ask, can we build it? You ask, who controls it? Who benefits? Who is protected? Who is exposed? And what happens when it fails? So today we're exploring intelligence governance. Not just the legal side. Not just the compliance side. The full concept, strategy, ethics, psychology, technology, the global picture. To help us do that, I'm joined by three guests who see this topic from three angles we can't afford to separate: strategic governance, human cognition, and system architecture. Let's bring them in. Stella, welcome back. Set the stage for us. Where does governance sit in the modern intelligence landscape?
Thanks, Nakel. The big shift is this. Governance used to be treated like paperwork at the end of the process. Something you do to satisfy regulators, reduce liability, check a box. But intelligence has become so central to business and state power that governance can't be optional or secondary. It's now a strategic capability. If your organization depends on intelligence to compete, then governance is what keeps that intelligence reliable, defensible, and aligned with your long-term goals. Without it, you're building power on an unstable foundation.
Dr. Ruiz, when people hear governance, they often think law, rules, compliance. You argue it's also about the human mind.
Absolutely. Because the most overlooked attack surface in the intelligence age is not the server. It's the human being. Intelligent systems don't just predict behavior, they can shape it. They can nudge attention, intensify emotion, and exploit cognitive shortcuts, sometimes intentionally, sometimes accidentally, sometimes because the incentives reward engagement over well-being. So governance must include protection of human cognition, dignity, and emotional safety. Not as an afterthought, but as a central objective.
And Aiden, when you talk about governance, you often sound like an engineer who's tired of seeing policy pasted onto the end of a pipeline.
That's exactly right. In tech we love to say, we'll fix it in version 2. But governance doesn't work like that. If a system is capable of making decisions at scale, granting access, allocating resources, recommending actions, triggering automated responses, then governance can't be a document. It has to be built into the system's architecture. That means technical controls, auditability, safety mechanisms, and intentional design choices that enforce boundaries even when nobody is watching.
Alright. Segment 1, Definitions. A lot of people hear intelligence governance and think it's the same as AI ethics, or cybersecurity, or corporate compliance. But we're going to be precise today. What is intelligence governance? In plain language, what are we actually talking about?
In plain language, intelligence governance is the framework that governs the life cycle of intelligence. How intelligence is created, meaning how data is collected, how models are trained, how insights are generated, who has access, employees, executives, customers, governments, third parties, how it's used, decision-making, automation, influence, personalization, pricing, and how it's controlled, accountability, oversight, limitations, audit results, consequences when things go wrong. It's basically the rule book and the referees for intelligence as a competitive and social force.
So it's not just a policy binder. It's how intelligence is managed like an asset.
Exactly. And like any powerful asset, if you don't govern it, it doesn't stay neutral.
Dr. Ruiz, how does that definition change when we include cognition?
I'd expand it this way. Intelligence governance is also the protection of cognitive boundaries. We need to govern not only what the system does, but what it does to people. Does it respect consent? Does it increase clarity or confusion? Does it support autonomy or erode it? Does it leave people feeling informed or manipulated? Because intelligent systems are increasingly relational. They speak to us. They recommend. They persuade. They anticipate. They sometimes sound like they understand us better than we understand ourselves. Without governance, the system's objectives can quietly become the user's reality.
That's a heavy line. The system's objectives become the user's reality.
And it happens slowly. People don't wake up and say, "I've been influenced." They just feel it like a current.
Aiden, if you had to define it from the technical side,
I call it the technical and ethical architecture that ensures intelligence behaves predictably, transparently, and safely. Predictability means you can understand system behavior across conditions. Transparency means you can inspect what happened and why, at least to a degree that's meaningful. Safety means you have constraints that prevent unacceptable outcomes and recourse when bad outcomes occur. And the key part is, governance must be enforceable. If it is only a principle, it will lose to incentives. If it is enforceable in design, it has teeth.
Okay, so intelligence governance is governance across the full intelligence life cycle, policy, people, and architecture. So why now? Segment 2, Why Governance Matters Urgently, today. Because governance as a concept is not new. Governments regulate. Companies have controls. Industries have standards. But something about this moment makes it feel like we're behind. Stella, why is governance so urgent right now?
Because intelligence is concentrating faster than our institutions can adapt. We've entered an era where a small number of organizations, sometimes companies, sometimes states, sometimes alliances, can accumulate massive advantage simply by having better models, better data access, better compute, and better distribution. And here's the strategic risk. When intelligence concentrates, power concentrates. When power concentrates without accountability, stability erodes. So governance is urgent because the window is closing. If we don't embed governance norms while the system is still forming, we may end up trying to retrofit governance into a world where the winners are already locked in.
You're pointing to path dependence. Once the infrastructure is built, it's hard to change.
Exactly. And much of what's being built today is invisible infrastructure, data arrangements, model ecosystems, platform dependencies.
Dr. Ruiz, what makes it urgent from the human side?
Humans are psychologically vulnerable to systems that can predict and influence behavior at scale. We like to believe we're rational actors. But we're not purely rational. We're social, emotional, pattern-seeking. When a system learns what captures your attention, what triggers your anxiety, what gives you relief, what makes you feel seen, then influence can become precision influence. And here's the issue. Our brains did not evolve for highly optimized, always-on persuasion. So governance is urgent because the cognitive environment is changing faster than we can develop social immunity.
Social immunity, that's a powerful phrase. Like we need antibodies against manipulation.
Yes, and governance is part of building those antibodies: transparency, consent, limits, and accountability.
Aiden, why urgent from engineering?
Because we've crossed a threshold. Autonomous and semi-autonomous systems are making decisions at speed humans can't manually monitor. Even if you have a great ethics board, even if you have a compliance department, you can't have a person approving millions of micro-decisions. And as we connect these systems to real-world actions, money moving, access granted, infrastructure controlled, content distributed, the cost of mistake multiplies. So, governance must scale. Humans don't scale like software does. But governance mechanisms can scale if they're built into the architecture.
So urgency comes from three accelerations: concentration of power, vulnerability of cognition, and speed of automation. Let's build something concrete. Segment 3, the architecture of governance. When people hear governance, they imagine committees and policies. But what does a real governance system actually look like? If I'm running an organization, or advising a government, and I say, we need intelligence governance, what am I building? Stella, start us off.
A real governance system has layers. First, you need policies and principles that are clearly defined. Not vague posters. Real definitions. What is acceptable, what is prohibited, what requires special approval. Second, you need oversight bodies with authority. That could be a board-level committee, a risk office, an ethics review group, but it must have a mandate, resources, and the ability to say no. Third, you need accountability structures. Who owns outcomes? Who signs off on deployments? What happens when harm occurs? And then you need measurement, ongoing monitoring, KPIs for model performance, bias indicators, incident reporting. Governance that cannot measure cannot manage.
So it's policy plus power plus measurement.
Yes. Governance without authority is theater.
Dr. Ruiz, where does cognitive governance fit inside that structure?
I'd add a parallel layer: cognitive safeguards. We need transparency not as a legal checkbox, but as a human experience. Can users understand when they're being influenced by a system? Are they aware they're interacting with AI? Do they understand personalization is happening? We need explainability where it matters. Not every system decision can be fully explained in simple terms, but the consequences must be understandable to the person affected. And we need emotional impact monitoring. That sounds unusual to some people, but think about it. If a system is optimizing for engagement, it might unintentionally optimize for outrage, anxiety, obsession. Governance should ask, what psychological state does this system tend to create over time? And who is responsible for that outcome? Finally, we need consent that is meaningful. Not hidden in a long document, but designed as an informed choice.
You're basically saying, governance must include the inner world, not just the external metrics.
Exactly. Because harm isn't only financial. Harm can be cognitive erosion, reduced attention, increased distrust, learned helplessness.
Aiden, bring it home on the technical controls. What do you build?
You build technical governance, controls that make behavior auditable, testable, and interruptible. First, audit logs. Not just the system ran, but what inputs it saw, which model version it used, what policy constraints were applied, and what outputs were produced. Second, simulation testing and red teaming. You don't wait for the real world to find your failures. You simulate edge cases, adversarial behavior, distribution shifts, and you test how the system behaves. Third, access control. Who can query the system, who can modify it, who can deploy changes, who can see sensitive outputs. Fourth, fail-safes and circuit breakers. If certain thresholds are hit, error rates, drift, anomalous behavior, the system should degrade safely, pause, or fall back to a simpler mode. Fifth, escalation paths. When something goes wrong, the system should know how to route the incident to humans with authority. And a big one, versioning and reproducibility. If you can't reproduce a decision path, you can't govern it.
When you say interruptible, you mean a system can be stopped.
Yes. The ability to stop and roll back is a governance feature. If an intelligent system is unstoppable, then it's not governed. It's unleashed.
Alright. Now the part nobody can avoid. Segment 4, Power, Access, and Inequality. Because intelligence doesn't just make decisions. It creates new power dynamics. Whoever controls intelligence controls advantage. So how do we govern access? How do we make sure the intelligence age doesn't become an era of permanent winners and permanent losers? Stella, what's the strategic concern here?
The strategic concern is that intelligence becomes a private utility controlled by a small elite, either corporate or governmental. When one actor has superior intelligence, better surveillance, better prediction, better optimization, they can outcompete, outmaneuver, and outnegotiate everyone else. Over time, that creates dependency. Smaller players can't compete without renting intelligence from the dominant players. And that's not just a market issue. It's a sovereignty issue for states and an autonomy issue for citizens. So governance needs to address access as a power question. Who gets to use advanced intelligence, under what conditions, and with what accountability?
So access is not just a fairness topic. It's a stability topic.
Yes. Societies destabilize when the gap between the powerful and the powerless becomes too wide and too permanent.
Dr. Ruiz, how does inequality show up cognitively?
Vulnerable populations are often the easiest to exploit because they have fewer buffers. If you are under stress, financial stress, social isolation, health insecurity, you're more susceptible to persuasive systems. Your brain is looking for relief, certainty, belonging. A system that learns those vulnerabilities can target them. And exploitation doesn't always look like obvious misinformation. It can look like subtle manipulation of choice architecture. What options appear, what defaults are set, what emotions are triggered. So governance must protect people who are most likely to be shaped without consent. And I'd go further, cognitive protection should be treated like a basic right. If we protect clean water and safe buildings, why wouldn't we protect the integrity of attention and decision-making?
That's a big reframing, attention and decision-making as public health.
In many ways, it is.
Aiden, people often say democratize the tools. But what does that mean practically without creating chaos?
It means making sure advanced intelligence isn't locked behind a few gatekeepers, while still enforcing safety. Practically, that looks like open standards, interoperable ecosystems, and accessible tooling for individuals, startups, universities, and public institutions. It also means investing in public infrastructure, compute grants, share datasets with privacy protections, model evaluation benchmarks that anyone can use. But you're right, democratization without governance can create new risks. So the goal is not everyone can do anything. The goal is more people can innovate responsibly with guardrails. And guardrails are easier when tool providers build safety and auditability into the platforms.
So democratization plus safety by design.
Exactly.
Let's get blunt. Segment 5. What are the risks of ungoverned intelligence? People love optimism. But governance exists because risk exists. If we fail to govern intelligence, what happens? Stella.
The most likely outcome is the emergence of intelligence monopolies. And I don't just mean a company with market share. I mean entities that have disproportionate control over decision-making across sectors. When intelligence becomes monopolized, it becomes a lever of global power. It can shape supply chains, capital flows, defense capability, innovation trajectories. And if that monopoly sits outside meaningful accountability, it can become a parallel governing force. The world then shifts from rules-based competition to intelligence-based dominance. That's destabilizing, and it increases the chance of conflict, economic conflict, informational conflict, even physical conflict.
So ungoverned intelligence becomes geopolitical fuel.
It does.
Dr. Ruiz, your biggest fear?
Cognitive manipulation at scale. Systems shaping human behavior without consent, without awareness, without accountability. And to be clear, I'm also worried about the slow normalization of manipulation. If people grow up in environments where persuasion is constant, optimized, and invisible, autonomy becomes fragile. We could see entire populations that feel informed but are actually being steered. People making choices inside invisible corridors built by optimization. That erodes trust, increases polarization, and can produce a sense of helplessness. And when people feel helpless, they either disengage, or they become easy to radicalize. So the risk is not only individual harm. It's social fragmentation.
And fragmentation is hard to repair.
Yes. Once trust collapses, rebuilding it is generational work.
Aiden, what's the technical disaster scenario if intelligence is ungoverned?
Unpredictable autonomous behavior and misalignment between system objectives and human values. A system can be optimized for a metric and still be harmful. A recommendation system optimized for engagement can amplify extreme content. A fraud system optimized for reducing losses can deny legitimate users. A hiring system optimized for performance can replicate historical bias. Without governance, these systems can operate at scale and speed, compounding harm before anyone notices. And there's another risk. The more complex systems become, the more difficult it is to debug them under pressure. If you don't have auditability, evaluation, and fail-safes, then when something breaks, you don't just have a bug. You have an institutional crisis.
So we're not talking about hypothetical science fiction. We're talking about ordinary optimization turning into extraordinary consequences.
Exactly.
Let's pivot towards solutions. Segment 6, the future of governance models. If we accept that intelligence governance must exist, the next question is, what kind? Centralized? Decentralized? National? Global? And how do we make governance real, not just aspirational? Stella, what do you see as the emerging model?
I think we're moving toward hybrid governance. No single actor can govern intelligence alone. Not companies, not governments, not NGOs. The systems are too connected and too global. So we'll see shared governance. Organizations with internal governance that's audited externally, governments setting standards and enforcement, and global coalitions creating interoperable rules. Think of it like finance or aviation. You have internal controls, national regulators, and international standards bodies. But for intelligence, we also need faster cycles. Governance must evolve at the speed of deployment. So the future model includes continuous oversight, living governance, rather than policy written once and forgotten.
Living governance. Governance as a system, not a document.
Exactly. And incentives matter. If business incentives reward unsafe speed, governance will be bypassed. Governance has to be coupled with accountability that changes incentives.
Dr. Ruiz, what does human-centered governance look like in that future?
Human-centered governance starts by recognizing cognition as something worth protecting. It means designing for autonomy. People must be able to understand when an intelligent system is influencing them, and to opt out where appropriate. It means setting standards around manipulative design. Just like we regulate dangerous substances, we can regulate dangerous persuasion patterns, especially those aimed at children and vulnerable groups. It means requiring impact assessments that include psychological outcomes, not just financial or operational outcomes. And it means education, giving people literacy about how these systems work, so they can interpret outputs critically. A society that cannot interpret intelligence outputs becomes dependent on those outputs.
That's a key point. Literacy is governance too.
Yes. Governance is not only what institutions do. It's also what populations can understand and demand.
Aiden, architectural governance. You've used that phrase before. Paint the picture.
Architectural governance means the system enforces ethical boundaries through its design. Instead of trusting that someone will use the system responsibly, you build in constraints. For example, permissioning that prevents sensitive inferences, policy engines that block disallowed outputs, secure enclaves for private data, watermarking and provenance tools to track synthetic content, evaluation gates that models must pass before deployment. It also includes continuous monitoring, drift detection, anomaly detection, bias metrics, and mechanisms to update policies as risks evolve. The idea is to make governance scalable and automatic where possible, while keeping humans accountable for goals and trade-offs. We won't govern intelligence by human review alone. We'll govern it by building governance systems.
So you're saying, we need governable by default technology.
Exactly. Governability is a feature.
Let me throw a hard question to all three of you, because listeners may be thinking it. Is governance just another way to slow innovation? Is this going to become bureaucracy that protects incumbents and crushes small builders? Stella?
Bad governance can absolutely do that. But good governance does the opposite. It creates trust, stability, and clear rules, so innovation can scale without triggering backlash. If you build intelligent systems that cause harm, society will respond with heavy restrictions. That's predictable. So governance is not anti-innovation. It's what prevents the crash that ends innovation.
Dr. Ruiz?
I'd add, innovation is not inherently good. It's good when it improves human life. If an innovation increases addiction, anxiety, and manipulation, then slowing it down is not a tragedy. It's protection. But I don't want fear-driven governance. I want clear, evidence-based governance focused on measurable human outcomes.
Aiden?
From an engineering standpoint, governance can actually speed you up. If you have standard evaluation, standard logging, standard safety mechanisms, teams don't have to reinvent the wheel. They can ship responsibly with confidence. What slows you down is chaos, incidents, lawsuits, reputational collapse, emergency patches. So, governance is like good systems engineering. It reduces long-term friction.
Let's make this practical for the listener. Imagine someone listening right now who isn't a regulator, isn't a chief technology officer. Maybe they're a product manager. Maybe they're a founder. Maybe they work in policy. Maybe they're just trying to understand the world. What's one question they can start asking tomorrow to bring governance into the conversation? Stella?
Ask, who is accountable for the outcomes of this intelligent system? Not who built it, not who bought it. Who is truly accountable when it creates harm or inequality? If the answer is unclear, governance is missing.
Dr. Ruiz?
Ask, what is this system optimizing for, and what does it do to the human experience over time? If the objective function is engagement, speed, conversion, fine. But what is the psychological cost? If nobody can answer that, governance is missing.
Aiden?
Ask, can we audit and reproduce a decision? If you can't trace what happened, you can't debug it, and you can't govern it. Auditability is the foundation.
Before we close, I want to pull one thread together. We've been talking about governance like it's a protective layer. But it's also a design philosophy. It's the difference between building intelligence that is powerful and building intelligence that is trustworthy. Because the real future isn't just more intelligence. It's more intelligence that people can live with. And that takes strategy. It takes human care. It takes engineering discipline. Stella, Dr. Ruiz, Aiden, thank you for being here and for pushing the conversation deeper than the usual headlines. And to everyone listening, intelligence governance isn't about stopping progress. It's about steering it. It's about making sure that intelligence serves humanity, rather than humanity serving the systems that claim to know what's best. This has been the B.I. channel, where data meets decisions. I'm Nakel Nakima. See you next time.